Item number 11, the 2019 and the elections and the opportunity to establish a Māori ward. And could I ask Phil Wilson to stay at the table, thank Linda and the other officials on the last paper, and ask you to speak to it briefly. Could I also acknowledge that Dale Ofsofsky is here for this item and for item number 12. Welcome, Dale.
Oh, there he is.
Right. I think, Phil, if you do an introduction, and then I'll move 11A, well, the first part of 11, then that will be subject to amendment if you wish to change it.
Tēnā koe koramatua.
And welcome to Oliver too, I'm sorry, he's joined us.
Look, I'll just cover half a dozen points quickly. This is a matter that those who have been on the council for a while or another council will know that this is a matter that's we regularly have to turn our mind to. In this case, in the context of deciding whether there would be a Māori ward in the 2019 election. The reality is that you can choose to go down this path, or you can choose not to today. It's likely that choosing to go down this path will lead to a poll. That could happen anyway in terms of proponents for this seeking a poll as well, a point that's not always appreciated. There are some costs associated with that poll. $1 million. It is something for you to consider what the experience has been with such a poll under the current legislation elsewhere. They have seldom succeeded, and in some cases the debate around the poll has been divisive. It's not a reason to shy away necessarily, but it is a reason. It is important in that context, given the way the polling provisions work, that there is, if you want to go down this path, that there is appropriate leadership and communication and support of the poll provision. Again, highlighted in the report, a second quite material point is that with the current constraint on the number of members of the Auckland governing body per the Auckland legislation, the advent of a Māori ward would mean that we needed to reconfigure all of the other wards, and we would drop from 20 to 19 general wards, thus requiring boundary issues to balance out. That is a point of advocacy previously for this council. As yet, we've not succeeded in having that piece of legislation changed, and we're pursuing that per resolutions of this governing body made through the post-electoral process anyway. So just the very final point is that discussions around the IMSB role and the Māori ward often get conflated. The fact is that these provisions operate independently. The IMSB is there by virtue of legislation. Having a Māori ward would not change that. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much for that, Phil. Dale, is there any comment that you want to add to that discussion?
The whole thing. Well, yeah, but
No, just to reiterate those points, that if a poll was held, it's likely to fail from evidence of the other polls, pretty much 20% for and 80% against, so yeah.
Yep.
And cost
Oliver, anything you want to add?
And cost a lot of money.
$1 million.
Okay.
As a standalone poll.
Councillors, I know we had quite a long session, but we just need to focus on this at the moment. We have three options that are set down in front of us. What I'm proposing to do pro forma is to move A, in the knowledge that there is an amendment to A in the name of Councillor Alf Filipaina. But I think If I move A and the amendment fails, A is still an option for us. I have had discussions with some but not all councillors, and the sense that I've got is that there is less support for either B or C. It might be A or the amendment to A. So I'm proposing to move A, but then, and it's moved and seconded by Desley Simpson, and then invite, I'm going to ask for questions first before we get into the debate, but invite Alf to move his amendment. So we'll have the first discussion on the amendment. If the amendment fails, A will remain as the motion on the paper. So first of all, that's been moved and seconded. At this point, I'll invite questions from councillors to our officials. Councillor Casey.
Point of order first.
Point of order, Councillor.
Yeah, look, can I just say, because I've indicated and had a discussion with yourself and others, the fact that you know that there is an amendment, my point of order is, shouldn't that amendment first be discussed and
yes,
questions?
It will be.
Yeah, I'm just hearing you say now that you wanted questions on your A.
No, sorry, I wanted questions on the issue across the board, not on my specific. I've moved it pro forma only.
So what I'm, again with the point of order, and I'll be guided by this, is that shouldn't my amendment now go up as a result? It's been indicated to you that I have an amendment to your recommendation from the paper. Can I just get a clarification from Sandra and Kalinda around that?
The clarification, and if I'm wrong, I'll be corrected, is that if, with your amendment now on the table, the first debate will take place around your amendment. If that passes, the original motion lapses. If your amendment failed, then we would go back to the original motion. I just want to keep the original motion there as an option, because not every councillor will necessarily support the amendment.
So this discussion now that's going to take place is in regards to the amendment?
The first debate will be around the amendment, but this is a question to see if this is an opportunity to see if there are any questions from officials about the broad paper.
That's okay.
Yep, great. So are there any questions? Councillor Hulse.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to try and not to conflate too many issues into one question, but in item 12, we're going to go on and discuss election at large. So my question is to try and get over the thorny issue of the lack of appetite for legislative change that successive governments have displayed in allowing Auckland Council to up its numbers by one to accommodate a Māori ward. If we changed to a part election at large model, could that incorporate a Māori ward as part of that election at large model? And the reason why I'm asking that at this time, Mr. Mayor, is that it may well be that depending on what happens out of this item's discussion, the ability to still consider in the wider context a Māori ward in the at-large discussion.
Through your worship, in truth I'd have to have a look at the detail. I believe the answer's yes, it is feasible, but the ward structure is dictated by the numbers numbers of voters in each ward. So we'd have to check that the appropriate sized Māori ward made sense in the context of a reduced number of wards as opposed to elected at large positions, if I understood the question.
I'll just signal, Mr. Chair, regardless of how this unfolds, that may help us. For those of us who marched up Queen Street in support of Māori wards, I think I would love to see a Māori ward. I'll be really clear and lay that on the table. I am, however, very sympathetic to the throwing our complete ward and board. We talked for an hour and a half about what we were going to be called to then, undo and unbutton the entire ward and board system is just kind of beyond our ability to cope at the moment. So I'm hoping we will step into a solution, and I'll be keen to hear more about the amendment when it's spoken about.
Thank you very much, Councillor Casey.
I've got two questions for whoever would like to answer them. The first is the Independent Māori Statutory Board's cogent criticism of this report and its scare tactics. I think I need a response from somebody in that we've got I'll read you what they say and you can respond. Identifying the cost of $1 million for a referendum as a risk is a poor way to consider the opportunity for Māori wards.
The IMSB was consulted in the development of this report, and their feedback was incorporated or at least noted. I can't resile from providing advice to the governing body of the cost of a poll. To the point of the value of Māori wards in ensuring a Māori perspective, a Māori voice into decision making in Auckland, I think that the value of that, the importance of that is well made in the report.
Thank you. Just needed your response, Phil. You can probably do the second one too then. While you list on page 87 all the councils who've been subject to a petition for a poll, what you fail to marry up is that Auckland is the only council where we had a Royal Commission recommending not 1, not 2, but 3 Māori seats. So I'd like you to talk to that. And I think Councillor Hulse mentioned the hikoi. I was also on that. You haven't mentioned the political controversy around the Māori seats during the time of the Royal Commission setting out, during the Rodney Hyde era where he completely ignored what the Royal Commission had to say. So can you just comment on that? So we've got this, I mean, there is, if you read this, you'd say, oh, no chance, not a chance, far too risky. That's what the report does. And I'm ignoring that because I support, as Councillor Hulse did, I support a Māori seat. I support 3 Māori seats.
Through your worship, this report most certainly does not argue against Māori wards. It describes the implications of going down that path, as I think is our obligation to do. As to the history is, yes, there was considerable debate. There were recommendations from the Royal Commission. They were not picked up through the legislative process in the formation of the council. The ball was kicked into your court, and the limitation in the number of councillors presents you with a difficulty. All I can do is paint that picture for you.
I think just partly to reflect on the question politically, I think what our officers have said and our electoral officer has said is that in the event that we were to adopt B or C, or B I should say, there would likely be a petition for a referendum, and if there were a referendum, given the history of such referenda in recent years for other councils, the odds on that being lost are very high. I don't think they're trying to influence our debate one way or the other, but they are, as they're obliged to do, indicate to us what the consequences of one of those options might be. I think they've set it out in a factual way. I don't think they're trying to intervene in the substantive nature of the debate.
But my argument is that Auckland's a special case because of the Royal Commission, because of the amalgamation, and because Hyde ignored the recommendations of the Royal Commission.
I guess having knocked on many thousands of doors, I would expect Aucklanders probably to behave as other councils have. I can't demonstrate that empirically. I haven't done polling on it, but that would be my anticipation, notwithstanding the Royal Commission. Phil Wilson, you had another comment?
I might observe as well that the poll provisions have been the subject of a lot of discussion, and some councils and others have moved in the direction of have attempted to get the legislation changed so that the poll provisions are not as restrictive in the formation of Māori wards.
Thank you very much. Councillor Sayers.
Oh, thank you, Your Worship. 2 questions. when I read the paper, Phil, we just got it a few days ago, it's a lot to digest. The impact of it is quite significant, in terms of the number of general councillors, possible disestablishment of the Independent Maori Statutory Board, redrawing of boundaries. It's quite significant. So my question is, why haven't us as councillors had a more educational workshop this prior to today? That's question number one. And question number two is just understanding, because I've heard the figure of a poll or going to referendum or a poll could cost $1 million. The report talks about the opportunity to almost a tenth of that at $150,000. Just explaining the difference between those two options, if you could, please. Thank you.
Taking the last one first, the economy, the $150,000 option essentially economises through using the next local government elections. So Dale's costs, which are, I don't mean to say Dale's personal costs here, but the costs of the contract to support the election, we leverage that, and hence if we have to do a bespoke poll, we have to work with Dale to essentially run a separate exercise touching every constituent in Auckland.
Right. Okay. So a lot cheaper.
And I might say, oh no, I won't go there.
Okay. And the first one, Phil?
Just refresh my.
Whether it was why it hasn't been workshopped.
That's probably legitimate criticism. It has been workshopped in the past. We didn't on this occasion. However, it was traversed in the joint meeting between the governing body and the IMSB. So those of you who were at that meeting will be familiar with that.
Okay, next question, Councillor Filipaina.
Thank you, Your Worship. And tēnā koe, Dale, good to see you. Look, I just got, Phil, can I confirm that on our report that, by your calculation or staff's calculation, that there's only going to be only the one ward as a result of the population? So, if we put aside the Royal Commission, but from what you're saying, there's only the ability as a result of the population is one ward?
That's correct.
Confirm? Okay. Can you also confirm that if we look at B, staff recommendations, and I know that A has been put by His Worship the Mayor. If we look at B, and again, it's the cost, the $1 million cost that we have. I mean, I tend to agree with the Independent Māori Statutory Board around that value and putting it there, because ultimately the question we need to ask ourselves is, what is the cost for really something that should be there anyway? But if we have a look at B, are you saying that we cannot, if, for example, we put in like a recommendation around approving in principle, that we cannot have a poll in the 2019 elections? Do we have to go through to a petition for a poll that will cost the $1 million?
Council can resolve to hold a poll if it wishes to. They can set a date for the 12th of October 2019 to hold a poll in conjunction with the 2019 triennial elections, and that's a much lower cost. If it doesn't set a poll, then the poll must be held immediately within 89 days, and that's the standalone poll. That's your $1 million cost. And that must be conducted and finished by the 21st of May next year, so the outcome is effective for 2019.
So those two don't need to be together. What I'm saying is that if you go for awards, whether it be in principle or you resolve, you don't then have to have that petition for a poll. Am I correct in saying that?
That's correct. If you resolve to hold a poll, then there's no public notice, so there's no trigger to for the public to demand a poll, because a poll's already scheduled. Okay.
And just one more further question, Your Worship. Phil, if this is a question that you can't answer, and please obviously don't, but with the amendment that I'll be pushing through with the second from Councillor Collins, whether you can, from your perspective, give an opinion or comment on there around what the amendment is trying to do. From your professional opinion.
Well, as I read the amendment, I take it to mean that you're seeking a principled position from the Auckland Council in favour of a Māori ward, but it's contingent on the change in legislation around councillor numbers.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you very much, Councillor Filipino. Councillor Mike Lee.
The question I'd like to ask does relate to the Independent Māori Statutory Board, which we all know came out of the legislation for the Super City, which is absolutely exclusive to Auckland. It is non-democratic, and there's a certain amount of controversy around the whole aspect of it. And given it was the creation of Rodney Hyde from the ACT Party, a certain amount of irony. I have always believed in Māori wards. I believe they're democratic and they allow the ordinary working people, the ordinary Māori person, to have an equal vote, whether they're a chief or not a chief. That's part of our contribution to the culture of Auckland and New Zealand, democratic heritage. So I've always supported the aforesaid ARA had a member for Northern Māori and a member for Western Māori, and it worked well. There were 28 members of that particular body. My concern is this, and my question is this. This will be problematic unless the legislation relating also to the Independent Māori Statutory Board is dealt with as well, because you're going to have an Independent Māori Statutory Board with 2 votes on everything, including rates, or budgets at least, and you're going to have a Māori ward as well, and I think that's going to be problematic. I think in terms of legislation, we have to also deal up front with the Independent Māori Statutory Board, its role, whether it stays around or not, and how it relates to, and its members relate to the elected or proposed elected member for this Māori ward. So I think that is something that would be a mistake to try and skirt around. That it is being skirted around says a lot for the effectiveness, actually, of the Independent Māori Statutory Board. But in terms of wider democracy and accountability, I think we have to tackle that problem as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take that as a comment rather than a question. Councillor Simpson, maybe we can move into comments now as well as questions.
So mine is a question, Your Worship, and it's a question to the mover and the seconder of the amendment. Your recommendation doesn't address the IMSB. What is your intention for the IMSB? Is it to continue and have a Māori ward, or to discontinue and have a Māori ward?
My intention is only to deal with the legislative change that that's been mentioned on there, because look, the Independent Māori Statutory Board was set up, as everybody knows, by government, and that's a separate conversation. That if the governing body wish to take that conversation on board, well then let's deal with it then. But what I'm saying is this one here, based on the report and based on both what Councillor Collins and I have is to deal with Māori wards, but only also to ensure that there is legislation in place, and that's really going to be up to His Worship the Mayor. So that's totally separate, and it needs to be separate.
So clarification, if I may, supplementary. So you're saying you want legislative change for the numbers of members for this governing body, but not legislative change around the IBSB?
Yeah, and if you have a look at 37, previous consideration by Auckland Council, That's the legislation and that's what the governing body. So that's in regard to 37, is to cover that one.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say in the proposal in front of us, the issue of the IMSB has been parked, it hasn't been addressed. That would need to be addressed, obviously, in due course if you were to have an elected member. Okay, so we're now taking comments. I've got Councillor Sayers.
I thought I was getting in the queue there, Your Worship.
Well, you were right at the front of it.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you very much. I'm probably, well, I will be speaking against the amendment. I think this is a constitutional matter, and it's correct that it should go to a full referendum. And for a cost of $150,000, if we took that avenue, I think the public would see that as extremely good value for money. Any councillor opposing a referendum would not be respecting the democratic rights of Auckland citizens to have a say about how and if Māori's representation should be in place for Auckland. So, Your Worship, I'm seeking, because obviously I was looking at C, and we've had an amendment moved.
It's still on the table, but it would lapse if the amendment or the current option A passed.
Right, so
You would vote, if you're in favour of option C, you would vote against the amendment and vote against option A,
and
in the hope that you might get enough numbers to get down to option C.
are we taking that order?
That's the logical way to take it. Yes.
I'm just seeking advice for clarification.
No,
Your Worship, if it
that's
should be an
fine.
amendment
And
or follow that process.
No, but that will be, we will vote first on the amendment. If the amendment passes, then that becomes a substantive motion and it would be carried.
Okay, thank you for that.
Councillor Filipaino, I should ask you to speak
Yep, to the
next
amendment.
because you are the
As-
mover of the amendment. Thank you. And Councillor Collins, as the seconder, if you'd like to speak after that.
Okay. Look, Your Worship, the reason the amendment's gone up there and interesting enough, it actually covers exactly what Councillor Sayers is talking about, believe it or not. One of the first things I want to make a comment on is number 2 on our agenda, and that is the rationale for establishing a Māori ward. And just to quote it, it's based on Treaty of Waitangi obligations. Participation of Māori in local government decision-making is one way of implementing the promise of tino rangatiratanga, chieftainship and also sovereignty. So that's one particular, that's one reason around the justification for this. So I only put that as a scene-setting one. And the reason I asked around the ward, because let's be real and put on the table that it's only one ward. I also understand, reading the report, that there has to be legislative change, because at the moment we can only have 20 governing body members, so we need legislative change, like the other councillors around New Zealand, who have the ability to change the numbers, whether it's less or more. We're the only council that cannot change the numbers because of the statute. The Royal Commission has been mentioned, and again, I'm not going to go through and tell everybody about the Royal Commission because all the comments are in the report. However, I do just want to say one thing around the comment around the Royal Commission is in 15, and that it is to give effect to obligations under the Treaty of Waitangi. The actual recommendation there basically is saying that we agree in principle to a Māori ward, but it's going to be dependent on legislative change. We have to get legislative change. I was part of the governance review in last term, and we spoke about Māori wards, and some of the comments that were passed around there was that some of the councillors, and rightly, wrongly so, but some of the councillors were saying, well, if we have to reduce this down to 19, that's wrong for representation around Tamaki Makaurau. This is why this is dependent. It's dependent on legislative change that will be led by His Worship the Mayor. In the report, there's a mention in the report around comments saying that, look, the government at the time, and we're moving into a new government very soon. We don't know where Honourable Winston Peters is going to fall, but there will be a new government. But it's still around, it's dependent on changing the legislation. This is why we've done this. We're saying, hey, in principle, let's have a Māori ward, but it's going to be dependent on changing the legislation. And Councillor Sayers mentions the $150,000. This is why I asked the question as to when we can have this poll. I agree. You know, I agree. The best scenario for me is that there is a change in legislation. That's the best scenario for me in regards to Auckland Council having the ability to actually set the numbers. Whether that happens or not, I'm looking forward to confirmation from the incoming government that no, we will not be changing the numbers and Auckland Council will stay with 19. Then the poll goes out, the $150,000 poll, that's going out. And this is why. So, look, I'm just saying, look, give us that space. We're still indicating in principle for a Māori ward, but give us that space so His Worship the Mayor will go down to Wellington, talk to the incoming government, and then have a look at changing the legislation to allow Auckland Council to change the numbers of governing body members. So, you know, but my last comment is let's do this, Your Worship.
That was very subtle, Councillor. Thank you for that comment. Councillor Collins, would you like to take a call at this stage? Or?
Yes, I will. Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Can I just, with the agreement, I've confirmed agreement with Councillor Filipina that rather than use the word concerning in the amendment, use the word supporting. And thanks, Councillor Darby, just for reminding me that that's because it's already been resolved previously by Council. So that's the read. Look, I'm in a way, you know, I was told coming into politics in 2013 that it's the art of compromise. And for me, this is about as compromised a position I could take. Probably not the best wording, but look, I'm completely supportive of Māori wards. I love the recommendation of the Royal Commission, which was to have one mana whenua appointment or ward and two Māori wards. And what we're trying to do here is at least remind ourselves that it's already been resolved, that we in principle agree with the establishment of a Māori ward. But as I started to listen to Councillor Holson and Councillor Casey, I was reminded that sometimes we've been challenged, because I remember when we had this discussion when I was chair of the local board and I said, let's go back to Wellington and let's ask them for legislative change. And immediately I was like, oh, they're not up for it. They're not interested in listening to us on that particular issue. And now we're about to form a government, whatever happens after the 7th of October, and one of these groups is saying that they want a referendum on the whole thing. And so I don't know just how warm any incoming government is going to be around legislative change. But in the art of compromise, I think this is the best way to go for now, because we support Māori representation. Bottom line is, this is about voice and representation, and I'm keen to see more than just the ethnic makeup of this council represented for Māori folk. We've got one person here and he's only half Māori, and we need to ensure, oh, two, we've got someone else. Are you half Māori as well, or a bit more? Or,
I'm full.
Yeah, there you go. So see, that's what I'd like to do, is see an extension of the way in which we're able to ensure that there's voice, that there's representation for tangata whenua, for mana whenua, for the indigenous peoples of this land. And so this is about making a real commitment, showing some action towards this. And whilst it's probably slower action than what I would prefer, I think this takes a compromise position in the sense that we're going to try our best to advocate to central government to say, look, change this crazy piece of legislation that restricts us as the biggest city in the country to just having 20+1 members. We've got to do better than that. And the government needs to hear this message very clearly from us, that we're not happy with the way in which they've just kind of avoided the issue. And I understand some have said, oh, look, we won't look at it for another 3 or 4 years. We've got to get past that. And we've got to say, if we're going to have good, strong, stable governance in Auckland, then what we've got to do is be able to work it out ourselves, but we've got to have a legislative change foremost. So that's why I'm happy to support Councillor Filipaina in proposing this recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Collins. Councillor Sayers.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, sorry, I thought you'd taken a call,
I had,
but
but if...
I'm not forcing you to take a call.
No, but look, if I could take the opportunity very quickly, Mr Mayor, just with the advice that you gave me earlier, if I could just foreshadow if the other two processes fail, that I could foreshadow option C, Your Worship.
Thank you. Thank you. That's fine. Councillor John Watson.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. Yeah, like everyone round, support the principle of democratic representation of people being elected to a position on the council, and I'm glad that the mover and seconder have signalled their proviso there, because clearly there are potentially negative or undesirable outcomes if there's a councillor removed from the mix, and you only have to go to the next item to see that, where we have our average number running at about 80,000. There's already a few overs and unders. Not only would a reallocation of boundaries affect the physical geography of representation, it would affect the numeric. And by my rough calculations, going on the basis of the Maori roll, that that would at least be running at about a 25% under from the average anyway, just at a ballpark figure, which is something that's not to be underestimated also. In the provisos that were signalled, I'm glad some of the other speakers have brought up the position of the IMSB, and I don't think, while that's not necessarily going to be dealt with here, in fact it's not, but I wouldn't want people to labour under the misapprehension that by supporting democratic representation of our Maori people, that automatically relates to a continued support of IMSB presence too. That's something quite different. So I know, I understand what Councillor Filipaina has said there. He's made that quite clear. It's an in-principle support, yep. and it's certainly hard not to support in principle democratic election for a Maori ward. But there are these other issues that go beyond that, and they would have to be addressed at the appropriate time, because there is a degree of piling taking effect here. So. Just finally there, Mr Mayor, obviously, the key contingency here is the numbers, and whether that can be changed legislatively, and also the fact that there is then the related issues of the presence and the role of the IMSB, in light of the fact that we would then hopefully have democratic Maori representation.
Thank you very much, Councillor. If there are no other calls, I want to take a call myself. Councillor Clow.
I'm certainly sympathetic to a Maori ward councillor being elected democratically, and if the numbers were such so that it was 2 in time, it would be 2. But unfortunately, I just can't support this amendment because of the confusion I think it could be relating to the last part of that amendment. And then also to agree in principle at this stage, I'm struggling with that, because if we were to get the ideal outcome with the government giving us the ability to determine our own numbers, I think at that stage we would then need to look in a very rational way at what we're going to do with overall representation, whether it be on the general ward basis, but also the Independent Maori Statutory Board, which I totally support. I'll make that quite clear, and I would see no change for that. If there was to be a Maori member then democratically elected, I would also see the Independent Maori Statutory Board going in parallel with it. But in the light of our decisions in the last paper, and particularly in EE and FF, where we said we're going to make no change to the wards at this stage, and we want to advocate for to the government, we're already covering that. So just in the case that this amendment is lost, I just wonder if the mover and seconder of the original A would be willing to say, receive the report, and then tack on the first part of Councillor Filipaino's and Collins's amendment up to governing body. So that that's in there as a reiteration of what we've done on the last piece of work.
If the amendment's lost, that's something, as the mover of the original, I'd contemplate. Thank you, councillor.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Hills.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm supporting the amendment as I whakapapa to Ngāpuhi, and I support democratic election. I support Māori wards like I support Māori seats, and I think they have a good place in our democracy. I'm very concerned about what a poll or referendum looks like. I have serious problems with the majority voting on minority issues or rights, as we're seeing right now with the yes-no vote in Australia. The people might be speaking, but while that's happening, a lot of damage and misinformation is happening, and I worry about the kind of conversations that come out of something like that as well. So I think this is a good way to go forward to change the legislation so we're in control of our destiny, or the destiny of the council, because changing and moving and what it does to boundaries of wards might not change the local boards, and then it does seem quite a confusing way to do it, and I'm concerned about opting straight to a poll because of my concern about Māori people in this country being subjected to potential what a referendum does, and also a vote going ways that 80% of other votes have gone, what damage that does to people, and what that says, like what's happening in Australia right now as well, to the LGBT community. I worry about that. So I'd support the recommendation. I think we need to look forward to what that means, and I think if this comes forward, then there would also be a discussion around what the Independent Māori Statutory Board looks like, if it stays or if it's replaced, or if it, that's a wider discussion that needs a full report on, not to be making any decisions now. So I'll be supporting the amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. If there's no other speeches, I want to make some comments myself, sorry. Okay.
Sorry, question?
Okay. Councillor Darby?
There is some, I've heard Councillor Clow just query the last part there, so I think it's fair to maybe ask the staff if they can just explain and reconcile the makeup of how we arrived at the one seat here in the report in proportion to the population versus the representation under the legislation that composes the Parliament. My understanding it's similar, but I wonder if it's probably good to flush that out, because I think there might be a misunderstanding of that proportional makeup.
So there is a formula established under the Local Electoral Act that determines the number, and it's based on the general electoral population and the Maori electoral population. So we've used the figures, the latest figures, population estimates as at June 16, and it comes out at 1.36, so under the formula. So because it rounds down to 1, if we got to 1.52, for example, it rounds up to 2. So that's the basis. So that 1.36 is based on the ceiling of 20 councillors.
Okay, that's in your proposal, and comparing it with the legislation that governs the Parliament?
I can't answer that. I'm sorry, I don't know the answer.
As I understand it, subject to correction, it's based on the number of people who enrol on the Māori rolls. So it is proportionate on the principle that it's one person, one vote, but if you're Māori, you have the opportunity, if you wish, to enrol on the Māori roll. If you do, the number of seats for the Māori, on the Māori seats will be proportionate to the number of people represented. Yeah. I thought that's pretty much the same formula that you're working on, Dale. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. That was helpful to sort that out. Look, if I can just finish up the discussion here, my intention is to support the amendment, but if the amendment fails to support the original, perhaps as amended by, in the way suggested by Councillor Clow, There are three parts to the amendment that I want to speak to that are the reasons why I want to support it. First of all, the legislative change to allow Auckland Council to determine how many council members we have. We are the only council in New Zealand that can't make that determination. So I'm not sure why, when they created the legislation for the super city, they decided that we would be treated differently. And the reason why this is relevant to the question of having a Maori ward is if we don't do that, as the paper explains, and we have 19 general wards and one Maori ward, we would lose the alignment between you as ward councillors and the local boards. And I think that that would be a significant loss. That's why this amendment by Councillor Filipaina is couched in that way, and that is why this council has taken that stance in the past. The second is agreement in principle to establish a Maori ward. I am on record as having supported having a Maori ward, and the reason for that is that we are a democracy, and if we want Maori representation on this council, it's better to elect it than appoint it. That stands for itself. There are two principles to democracy. One is the right to vote, and the second, that I want to move on to in my third point, is majority rules, but minority rights are respected. The third question is the consistency with Maori representation in Parliament. What I understand about the Treaty of Waitangi is that the issues, the genuine grievances that I think the vast majority of New Zealanders now acknowledge are best resolved when we follow a process that seeks a consensus rather than aggravates a division. My fear of what may be foisted on the country, depending on the outcome of the coalition discussions, of a referendum on Maori seats in Parliament would cause incredible division and hurt and take us back after the huge achievements we've made in recent decades under respective governments. And my fear about the referendum that would be held under this proposal is the same. I believe it would not lead towards creating consensus. I believe it would divide, it would rip our community apart. I just remember being in Northern Ireland and seeing after 300 or 400 years the same bitter antagonism between people based on their differences, totally illogical, but built on history and grievance. And for God's sake, have we learnt nothing in this country? We need to avoid that grievance festering and getting worse, and we need to build the basis so that we can move forward as one nation of many people. So I think the parliamentary formula is right. This is not about giving people disproportionate strength in their voting power. It's about allowing them one person, one vote. But if you're Maori and under the spirit of the Treaty of Waitangi, you choose to go on the Maori roll, that is how you elect your representative, other than being on a general roll or general ward. I see nothing in that offends against the principle of democracy, equality and fairness. So I think this amendment works reasonably well, but if it fails, I will go back to the original motion, because I think either B or C would entrench division, it would produce the same result that it's produced elsewhere, and would leave us as a city more divided and more worse off than we are at the present time. And of all things, I want this city to be an inclusive city, a united city, where Maori, Pākehā and other ethnicities can move forward together, rather than being divided one against the other because of superficial differences. There is nothing more fundamental to the health of a city, a community, a country, than having that sense of we have mutual respect and we honour the promises that we have made in the past. So I would urge councillors to support the amendment, or if this amendment failed, to support the original amendment as changed in line with the suggestion by Councillor Clow. So
Division, Your Worship.
You want to move it by division? Yes, so I'll ask officers to take the vote on the amendment, and we will do so by division.
Have to call this manually. Okay, Mayor Goff.
Aye.
Councillor Casey.
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Cashmore.
No.
Councillor Clow.
No.
Councillor Collins.
4.
Councillor Darby.
4.
Councillor Filipina.
Aye.
Councillor Hills.
Aye.
Councillor Hulse.
Aye.
Councillor Mike Lee.
Aye.
Councillor Sayers.
Against.
Councillor Simpson.
Against.
Councillor Stewart.
Against.
Councillor Sir John Walker.
For.
Councillor Watson.
Yes.
10-5. Carried 10-5.
I declare that amendment carried 10-5, and that is the result of our debate.
Thank you, Penny.
Thank you very much. I move it as the substantive motion. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
To the contrary, no. Carried. Can we now move, thank you very much for that, councillors. I think that was a helpful debate and in the right spirit. We move now